instead of it kind of being passed in Birmingham by the elected officials and that's it, residents themselves can create their own proposals and vote directly which proposals are their priorities.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
All right, folks, you're still listening to the Valley Labor Report. We are Alabama's only union talk radio program, and I'm really excited about this next conversation we have. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you know that we try to highlight folks inside of Alabama, folks particularly in the northern half of Alabama who are doing good work, whether that's inside a union or outside the unions. And that's what we're doing here today. I've got Rob Burton on the show, and I'm really excited for him to tell us a little bit about his organization, Sweet Alabama. So, Rob, you mind introducing yourself and tell us how you got into activism and organizing?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, Adam. I'm excited to be here talking with y'all today. So I guess a little bit about me. So I should note that I came from a family that was involved actually in investment banking.
Wow.
So I actually grew up in the top 1%.
Interesting.
Yeah, not your typical story that you're gonna hear on here when it
Right. No, that's not what I expected.
So I should say I have something called cystic fibrosis, which is a chronic illness, and it predominantly affects my lungs and my pancreas. So my first 3 years, between I was born and I was 3, I was basically 2 weeks in, 2 weeks out of the hospital, and luckily the medicine for that has come a long way. And I had, because of that economic background, right, of my family, I had lived in a community that didn't have as much air pollution. I had all of the resources I needed for nutrition and healthcare and all of that stuff to put me in the position to have the kind of health I have now, which, I think a lot of folks who would have been born with CF back in the 80s didn't have those kind of opportunities. And so I'm in a much better position than most folks. But my dad worked on Wall Street. He did actually merging and acquisitions. So he helped large companies become larger companies. And I really got involved in the community first and foremost because of my cystic fibrosis. Just starting canvassing in 6th grade, organizing my 6th grade buddies to come to the fundraisers, the big walkathons, all that kinds of stuff. And my dad, after 9/11, lost his job, and he moved out to LA, and he became a really bad alcoholic and cocaine addict. And he ended up taking his life when I was in high school. And so that just kind of thrust me further into community work. Between that, my CF, I just knew that I wanted to be involved in addressing issues in our community. And I didn't have any kind of political analysis. So it was more like tutoring middle school kids and stuff like that. But I guess I went to UAB for college, and Birmingham's got some of the worst air pollution in the country, and that just kind of propelled me into a lot of environmental organizing, but specifically through a lens of what's called environmental ableism, which is not discussed very much. We often talk about racism and classism. We don't as much talk about the environmental ableism. So people like myself who have chronic illnesses that are disproportionately affected by that pollution. And that really, I think, is kind of my tie-in from an intersectional organizing position. And I know that, if I was born in more of a working class background, I'd realistically be dead, from because of this disease. And so kind of being able to be involved in that intersection around environmental ableism, class, race, so forth. So that was kind of in college. And then I've been working for nonprofits doing organizing for the last 10 years at kind of that intersection around race, class, and class and environmental issues.
Wow. I mean, that's a hell of a story, honestly. I appreciate you sharing it with me, and I appreciate the journey that you've been on to get to this point. Um, I think it, yeah, I think it says a lot about you that you're willing to kind of own that story and recognize some of the privileges that you had, in addition to some of the struggles that you've had, and how those have related with each other, and have propelled you to try to get involved. I really respect that. And um, something that you mentioned about the air pollution that really resonated with me, because I've been learning more and more about that myself and trying to, come at it from a labor perspective, analyzing the environment and how it affects working class people. And I've been lucky enough to learn a little bit more in recent months, including from some folks down in your neck of the woods, GASP, for example, um, Panic, and some other organizations. And so, yeah, you're doing good work. I really appreciate that. And I think now's a good time for you to tell us about Sweet Alabama and your organization. What are y'all all about?
Absolutely. So I guess I should start by saying, so Sweet in itself, there were 7 of us who founded it in 2017. It's always been, a predominantly, the founders have always been predominantly Black women. And most of us live in the Birmingham area. And we created it because we realized that, in particular, being able to address these issues from that intersection with labor, there was not an organization really working truly from that class perspective in this work. So before I before I helped found Sweet, I did a lot around this intersection, but it was more related to agriculture. And I think because of my own issues around with my lungs and that air pollution, looking at that through that lens when it comes to energy has always been something that I've had a big interest in. And so we founded that in 2017. And in particular, what we wanted to do was, when it comes to addressing energy, a lot of folks say try and organize against the Public Service Commission, which is important, or do that kind of policy work. And what we really wanted to do was be able to address it on more of the community level, first and foremost. So so in Alabama, we don't just have the highest energy bills, residential energy bills. Like in Birmingham, we have the highest what's called energy burden. So percentage of income spent on that energy. And the reality is, the reason why we have such a high energy burden is not simply because of our high energy bills. It's because we have had such a high poverty rate that folks' homes are so dilapidated that they're living in, that the amount of energy they're using because their houses are dilapidated is much higher than in most states.
Right.
The story of the South in general, right? And so how do we help? We have a lot of folks in our community that are either, that are trained as say plumbers or electricians that are maybe unemployed or underemployed. And how do we essentially help either organize folks in that situation or young folks who are interested in going into these technical fields and teach them how to do home energy retrofitting, which we look at as much more expansive as the typical environmental group. Most folks would look at that as purely about energy efficiency. But the problem with that is if your HVAC system, if your heating and cooling system for your house doesn't work, then trying to make your house more energy efficient doesn't mean anything, right?
Right.
You have to take a more holistic approach around what that means to help folks address their housing. And an average house uses about 3 times the amount of energy as your average car, right? So this is a ability where we can decrease folks' energy bills by around 40%. That's 40% more of that money going to help folks, put food on their table, buy books for their kids when they're trying to go to school, you name it. But it also is a way for communities to build their own economies. If folks don't have control over the economies in their community, then all of that, that's the issue, right? That's the political issue. That's the economic issue. It's folks not having control of those economics in their community. So we can help folks begin to build their own community-owned businesses. That can be in collaboration with unions, or it could be separate. There's a lot of work in the country around unionized, worker-owned cooperative businesses.
Which we're a big fan of, obviously, on this show.
Exactly. And so that's kind of the route I think that we're moving towards as an organization, is how to use this work around housing and energy to be able to build like community-owned cooperative businesses and potentially unionized cooperative businesses.
I think that's so cool, because you're doing a lot of things really at once. You're hitting a lot of areas at once. You're addressing, by reducing energy consumption, right? You're addressing climate change. You're putting money into people's pockets by reducing their bills, and then looking at a bigger picture of actually like growing wealth in a community from the bottom up. And I think those are the kinds of ideas we need to be working on, really. And so I think everything you just described about Sweet Alabama and what y'all have going on is very interesting to me. I think it's much needed. I'm not familiar with any organizations up in North Alabama necessarily that are doing exactly what y'all are doing down in the Birmingham area. So, who knows? Maybe someone listening is going to get some inspiration from this. I wanted to ask next, was there any specific projects or anything that y'all have that you're working on right now that you wanted to talk about, or is there anything maybe coming down the pike that you expect in 2023?
So I guess I can say two things. One, which is related to our programming. One, which is related to some policy work. Because ultimately, to address these issues that we just discussed, right, you need ultimately both.
Mm-hmm.
So the one is definitely around home energy retrofitting. We had originally put it mostly on pause during the beginning of the pandemic, because we are going into people's homes. But we did restart that program this year, and we'll be just further extending and expanding that next year. So, the goal is there's kind of a two-pronged thing, right? One, which is being able to simply pay folks for their labor who want to be able to go into a home and retrofit it. The other is being able to train folks and essentially functioning as more of like a mutual aid program, where we can go in. I have options for people who are going to do it DIY if they don't want anybody in their home. But the other is being able to actually train folks, where we can, as one community member, it kind of told me, is like, if we could train folks en masse to do this, we could literally just kind of go down the block and just start retrofitting everybody's home, like down in the week, So,
and that would be so amazing. And I think that's the kind of vision that we got to have. And what if we do that, right? I mean, that would be so life-changing for so many people.
Absolutely. So that's one way that people will be able to get involved, is kind of through that route. And the other, which is kind of more of our policy angle, which we got involved. We're supportive of something called the Gulf South for a Green New Deal, which is a really extensive, expansive policy that includes a lot around labor, around how it relates to military and prison expenses, like you name it, it's in there. And so I do think the name holds a little bit of baggage to some people, which is a messaging conversation to have, but the policy itself is really comprehensive and beautiful.
I just learned about it. So I was in Houston a couple months ago for the Power Up Gulf Climate Summit.
Awesome.
And that's where I met some of the sisters and brothers with GASP and some of the other organizations, both in Alabama and elsewhere. And that's where I first learned about the Green New Deal for the Gulf South. And I think that's yeah, it's very interesting because the Gulf South, we have some of our own unique challenges down here in many senses of that word, but including the environment itself and the just the sheer location of petrochemicals and other polluters in our environment.
Right. So I think we got into a conversation essentially in 2020, our organization with 7 others, and it was basically, well, what would need to be happen to fund something like this, right? Because ultimately, this is not just a federal thing, right? This requires conversations on a local level, county, state, and there was ultimately the conversation of the biggest issue with being able to fund these kinds of programs around housing um, and issues around being able to build, community-owned economies around agriculture, you name it, is that people don't have control over how their city budgets are spent. And so we are working towards, in Birmingham, which we want to support anyone else who lives in another municipality, essentially be able to use this model. But we want to pass something called participatory budgeting, which literally just means that either a percentage or in some cases that's been an entire budget. Instead of it kind of being passed in Birmingham by the 10 elected officials, and that's it, in a city of over 200,000 people, that residents themselves can create their own proposals and vote directly on which proposals are their priorities to make sure that the budget funds those. So that way, if you want your park to be fixed up or you want to build a community-owned farm, you can vote directly for that and maybe not vote to support, say, more corporate subsidies. So these are the kinds of conversations that we're having, and there'll be both a lot of canvassing opportunities where folks can help us go door to door or phone bank, or other things along those lines to support this work.
I think that's fantastic. I've always been fascinated by the idea of the participatory budgeting, and I think a lot of times folks in political spaces do get so wrapped up in national politics that we neglect how important it is to start local. And I think that's one of those areas where there's a lot of really cool things that can be done. And then you link that up with movements to grow co-ops and to grow community land trust and community-owned farms. And suddenly, yeah, you are building a more democratic, cooperatively owned and operated type of economy in your area. And I think that should be one of our goals looking ahead, especially given the challenges that we're going to be facing. I mean, we already are facing multiple layers of crisis in this state, and it's only going to get worse given the state of the climate. So I think these sort of projects to grow wealth from the bottom up, to grow people power, and to build resiliency in our communities, it's right on time. It's right on time. So yeah, really appreciate what y'all are doing in Birmingham, and I think you're right. Hopefully, some other folks in other cities across Alabama will be able to watch what you guys are doing and maybe take some inspiration there, because in Huntsville, for example, it's 6 elected officials for a city that is now technically bigger than Birmingham, apparently.
Yes.
I know the metro area is definitely bigger in Birmingham, but so Huntsville's growing, and 5 city councilors and a mayor are making the determination on a pretty massive budget. And we've talked at length on this show about some of the issues with the Huntsville Police Department, and I know you can go to any city and find similar type issues, but it's a budget's a reflection of priorities.
Absolutely.
And to me, that would start with the actual participation in the budget itself. If people's voices are not heard in the process, how can we expect the outcome to reflect, the people's interests? So I think that's intriguing, and I love that y'all are doing that.
I'll end that with this one point that based on what you just said, which is our most recent canvassing that we were doing this year. The stat was that folks only felt like the budget was 42% equitable in the city of Birmingham.
Mm.
That's a pretty pretty bad stat right there. And there's no effort to address that. So
It's interesting you bring that up because one of the other segments I'm recording this week is on the political engagement in Alabama and the extremely low political engagement according to all these various metrics. But then you go talk to people face to face, and less than half of them feel like the budget is at all equitable. I mean, you start to see why there is this disengagement, right? And participatory budgeting is one way for folks to be engaged in the community and have a little bit more of a say-so in the wealth of their community that they all contribute to. We all do. So I did want to switch gears with the last little bit of this conversation, because I know that you were at the Troublemaker School in Montevallo in October. So most of y'all who are listening probably remember Labor Notes did hold a training called the Alabama Troublemaker School October, and held that in Montevallo. We had over 120 folks show up, including some folks from a couple of different states. Quite a number of unions and organizations were represented. And Rob, you were there, and you're coming at it from a little bit different angle than maybe some of the more traditional, union members in attendance. So that's why I was curious to know, what did you think about the event, and what were some of your takeaways, not just from the event, but also from the audience?
Absolutely. Well, I think my first thought is recognizing also that it's the first of its kind in Alabama. There's been a lot of great organizing going on in the state the last, decade. Obviously, in the labor realm, in the last 2 years in particular, we still have 2 different unions on strike in Alabama, that doesn't even include everything happening at Amazon, which of course is another big name one going on in that space.
Right.
So I think, to me, my first takeaway is that it is a sign of how the movement is building and growing in strength in Alabama. As you mentioned, it had amazing participation, especially for a first event, and how many different sections of the movement were brought together. And I think ultimately that ability for us to come together in that collective way to discuss, to build relationships, which is a crucial one, and to strategize, is what it's going to take for us to build a mass movement necessary. This is Alabama. Like, we have a very long storied history of being able to build mass movements. And on a national scale, I feel like the South is often ignored very heavily for its contributions to building mass movements in this country. I mean, the union movement started in the South and in Appalachia, and we're not credited for that. I think us being able to come together to rebuild those relationships across different sections of the movement is what it's going to take to build that power. And I think we definitely succeeded on that, from union organizers to rank and file members to immigrant rights groups to socialists and environmentalists. We really had a large swath of folks there. And I think that we're only having discussions about how we can build off of those relationships moving forward. On a personal level, I also think personally, I learned some cool, additional nuances about union contracts. And I think, honestly, it was during the training that you led, where we were discussing some nuances around union contracts and some of the organizing that goes on, in between contract negotiations to push for more concessions. And I found that really interesting, and it really helped me kind of envision some of that a little bit differently in a positive manner.
Right.
So it's definitely whenever we do more trainings along these lines in the future, I think this is a huge resource that folks should come to.
Yeah, and well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad you had those takeaways. And I really agree with you about the South and the way we're often neglected in the national political scene, the way we're often written off. Yes, it's a fact that our governments are dominated by reactionaries. Nobody knows that better than we do. We have to live under them, right? and that goes to your point that we have always been at the forefront of building mass movements in this country, because we haven't had a choice. And often we're dealing with issues of oppression and exploitation here before other folks are. Sometimes we're the testing ground, or however you want to look at it. So, yeah, I think it is remarkable to see a gathering of any sort in a place like Alabama, like that does have that diversity of what I'm just going to call like the people's movement broadly, from labor to environment to social justice. And I think you're right. I think the more we put our heads together, the more problems we can solve, and the more folks we can bring along. Because I'm sure for every one person that was there were two or three that would have been interested in being there. Suddenly you start doing the math. You're looking at a few hundred. You're like, wait a second, we've got a few hundred pretty dedicated activist types in the state of Alabama. What could we do if we all are coordinating and growing our networks? Because we all know some folks, and you start growing that. And I think, to me, knowing that there are folks out there like you, folks like the folks in your organization doing the kind of work you're doing, happening all over Alabama, and that's been one of the greatest things about doing this show, is learning more of this and learning who is out there, what kind of good work is already being done, and trying to lift up that work. Because to me, that's what it's all about. If we're all pulling in the same direction, if we're all contributing the way we can contribute, we can really make a difference. So, Rob, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate the work you're doing. Was there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to make sure we talked about today, or maybe any plugs you had to get out today?
I don't think I have any specific plugs.
Okay.
Now.
But you did have a couple of really interesting opportunities for folks to be getting involved in the year ahead, in terms of canvassing and in terms of getting involved with the home retrofitting. So for those of you who are in the Birmingham area, especially, if you're looking for a way to get involved, both of those sound like really great projects.
Absolutely. And I'm just looking forward to continuing these conversations and building these coalitions, because I really makes me think of, speaking of that Southern history of cross collaboration between different aspects of the movement. It just makes me think of striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, and that bringing together the civil rights movement, the union movement, and even anti-war movements, and that's when change really starts to shift. And I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us to get to that point, but we've finally turned that corner to get there, to move in that direction. And I think now's the time. If folks have been on the fence about getting involved in organizing, now's the time to do it.
Hell yeah. I think that's a great place to end. Thanks again, Rob Burton. Appreciate all your time today. Check them out, y'all. Sweet Alabama. You've been listening to the Valley Labor Report. Thanks again for your time, everybody.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project. And you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.